My name is Marcus Chen, a former sergeant in the 4th Infantry Division of the United States Army. I served for 12 years before everything fell apart. Today, at 43, I live secluded in a cabin deep in Montana, far from any military base, far from any dense forest, far from any place where shadows might move on their own. I'm recording this because I need someone to know. Because when I die, and I know I will die soon, I can feel them closing in again. Someone needs to keep warning others. The government will never admit it. Reports disappear. Soldiers are transferred to psychiatric hospitals, and families are given sanitized versions of the truth. But the truth is, there are things in the American forests, ancient things that indigenous peoples knew should remain buried. And we, with our military arrogance, our technology, our drones and satellites, continue to invade their territories. We continue to build bases on sacred lands. We continue to ignore the warnings. For years I thought I was crazy. What I saw those nights in the Arizona desert, what I felt crawling down my spine on patrol, what I heard whispering my name in the forests of New Mexico, I thought it was all just the effects of post-traumatic stress, military fatigue, loneliness. But then I began meeting others, veterans like me, soldiers who served on isolated bases, in regions near Native American reservations, in areas where the government conducted special exercises. We all had the same fragmented memories. We all woke up screaming from the same nightmares. We all carried the same feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. This is the story of 3 events. 3 moments when the boundaries between our world and something much older and more terrible were broken. 3 warnings that were ignored. If you're listening to this, if this recording somehow reached you, you need to understand one thing. These are not just legends. The Skinwalkers, the Shadow Watchers, the Dark Walkers, call them what you will. They are real, and they are waiting. The first story took place in 2019. At a base that doesn't officially exist on military maps. A monitoring and facility built in the heart of the Arizona desert, just 30 kilometers from the Navajo reservation. What began as a routine operation turned into a soldier's worst nightmare. You want to know about Fort Sentry? That's not its real name, of course. The real name has been classified along with everything that happened there. But I can tell you where it was. In the middle of nowhere, Arizona. An electrified fence encircling a square of sand and red rocks, a few prefab tents, communication towers, and a handful of soldiers doing, well, at the time, no one knew exactly what we were doing there. We were told it was border surveillance, trafficking surveillance, but the border was over 100 kilometers away. There were no major roads nearby. Nothing to justify a permanent military operation. There was just silence, and those hills to the north, where my grandmother always told me never to go. I should have listened to my grandmother. It was October. The Arizona desert in October is still hot during the day, but the nights, Jesus, the nights get cold as hell. I was commanding the night fence patrol, a security routine we did every night at 2 a.m. 4 soldiers, myself, Sergeant Rodriguez, Private Kim, and Private Thompson. Thompson was only 19 years old, a country boy from Ohio who had never seen a desert in his life. The fence was about 2 kilometers around. We walked clockwise, checking sensors, looking for breaches, and maintaining radio contact with base every 15 minutes. A simple operation we'd performed dozens of times. But that night something was different. It started with the coyotes. Normally, you could hear them howling in the distance during the early morning hours. It was part of the desert soundtrack. But that night, they were completely silent. Even the insects stopped making noise. It was as if the entire desert was holding its breath. Rodriguez noticed first. He was an Afghanistan veteran with an animal instinct for danger. He stopped in mid-walk and raised his hand, a signal for everyone to freeze. "Are you listening to this?" he whispered into the radio. "Hearing what?" I replied. "I'm not hearing anything." "Exactly." We stood there for 5 minutes, listening to the silence. It was unsettling, as if we were being watched, as if something enormous was circling us, keeping its distance, waiting for the right moment. We decided to continue the patrol, but everyone was nervous. Kim checked the bushes for every shadow. Thompson kept his finger on the trigger of his M4. Rodriguez was muttering prayers in Spanish. That's when we reached the northern section of the fence. There were footprints in the sand. Huge, bare footprints that looked human, but they were too big to be a normal person's. And there was something wrong with the shape. The toes were too long, and the nails left deep marks in the sand. "What the hell is that?" Thompson asked, shining his flashlight on the markings. The footprints came from outside the fence and followed the wire for about 100 meters before disappearing completely. There was no sign of where the creature, whatever it was, had emerged from the sand. It was as if it had simply vanished. Rodriguez knelt, examining one of the footprints. His face was pale in the moonlight. "Captain," he said, "those footprints are still warm." Before I could ask what he meant, we heard it. A sound I'll never forget for the rest of my life. It started as a low moan, like wind rushing through a cave, but gradually it became higher pitched, more human, like someone was crying, or laughing, or both at the same time. The sound came from the hills to the north, the same hills where my grandmother said evil spirits walked in disguise. "Base, this is North Patrol," I spoke into the radio. "We're hearing strange noises in the northern sector, requesting backup. Static. Base, respond." More static. Kim tried his radio. Nothing. Rodriguez did too. All our communications equipment was dead. That's when we saw the figure. She was on the other side of the fence, about 50 yards away. At first, she looked like a normal person, someone walking through the desert, but there was something wrong with her silhouette. Her arms were too long, her head was at an odd angle, and she moved unnaturally, as if her joints worked differently. Thompson shone his flashlight in the direction of the figure. The light hit it and, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ. It wasn't human, or at least, it wasn't human anymore. The skin was stretched tight over bones that didn't follow normal anatomy. The face was a terrifying mix of human and animal features, yellow eyes that reflected light like a predator's, teeth that were too sharp. And when it opened its mouth, "James," the voice came from the creature, but it sounded exactly like my grandmother. "James, you shouldn't be here." How did that thing know my name? How could it perfectly imitate my grandmother's voice? "Get away from the fence," I shouted. "Now!" The creature tilted its head like a confused dog. Then it smiled, and when it smiled, I could see it had way too many teeth. "You can't run from who you really are, James," she continued in my grandmother's voice. "The Navajo blood in your veins knows the truth. You know what I am." Rodriguez was muttering prayers more rapidly now. Kim was backing away, tripping over her own shadow. And Thompson was walking toward the fence. "Thompson, stop!" I shouted, but he kept walking, as if in a trance. His eyes were glassy, and he was muttering something under his breath. The creature was still smiling, and now I could hear more voices coming from it. Familiar voices. Voices of people we knew. "Tommy," said the creature, now with Thompson's mother's voice. "Tommy, come home, honey." Thompson reached the fence. The security lights should have come on. The alarms should have gone off. But nothing happened, as if all the systems had failed simultaneously. He placed his hand on the electrified wire. No spark, no shock. And then, impossible as it seemed, he began to pass through the fence. Not under, not over, through the metal, as if it were made of mist. "Thompson, no!" Rodriguez yelled and lunged forward, trying to grab the soldier. His hands passed over Thompson's body as if he weren't there. The creature laughed, a horrible sound that echoed across the hills. Thompson was on the other side of the fence now, walking toward her. And with each step he took, his body transformed. His arms grew longer, his spine curved at impossible angles, his face distorted. That was the last time we saw Private Thompson. We ran back to base. We ran like I'd never run before in my life. Behind us, I could hear that laughter echoing, multiplying, as if more than one creature was chasing us. When we arrived at the base, all our superiors were waiting for us, as if they knew exactly what had happened, as if they had been waiting. Colonel Martinez led us to separate rooms. They made us sign confidentiality documents. They said Thompson had deserted during the patrol, that he was likely trying to cross the desert into Mexico, that we had suffered a mass hallucination due to stress and exhaustion. But I know what I saw. We all know. Rodriguez was transferred to a base in Colorado the following week. Kim was medically discharged, severe post-traumatic stress disorder, and I stayed because I was the son of a Navajo woman, and they thought I could better handle the cultural peculiarities of the region. Cultural peculiarities. As if the horror we witnessed were just folklore. 3 years have passed since that night. Fort Sentry was officially decommissioned 6 months later. Resource reallocation, they said. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, when the silence becomes too heavy, I can still hear that laughter echoing across the hills. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I get calls where no one speaks. But in the background, very faintly, I can hear my grandmother's voice whispering my name. The thing is, my grandmother died when I was 12. Have you ever heard of Project Deepwatch? Of course not, nor should you have. It was classified the moment it began and buried deeper than nuclear secrets when everything went wrong. I was a senior civil engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers. I specialized in underground construction, excavations in difficult terrain. In 2020, I was assigned to lead a construction team at a facility in New Mexico. We were told it was a military communications bunker, top secret, top important. The location was isolated, 50 miles east of Roswell. Yes, that Roswell, in the middle of a tract of land that theoretically belonged to the Army, but had been Apache territory less than 100 years ago. Sacred land, according to historical records, a place where shamans went to commune with spirits. It should have been our first warning. The team was small, 12 people in total, 6 engineers, 4 excavation technicians, and 2 safety supervisors. All had top-secret security clearances. They all signed confidentiality agreements that essentially said that if we told anyone anything about the project, we would spend the rest of our lives in military prison. The job seemed simple at first. Excavate a 3-level underground complex. Install advanced communication systems. Create a network of tunnels connecting different sections. Nothing I hadn't done dozens of times before. But when we started digging, the soil was wrong. Completely wrong. According to geological studies, it should have been mostly sandstone and clay, typical of the region. But as we delved deeper, we began to encounter layers of material that didn't make sense. Limestone with carved designs, not normal hieroglyphs or petroglyphs, symbols that looked ancient, older than any known civilization in North America, and they seemed to repeat in specific patterns, as if they were warnings. We found bones too, human bones, but distorted, as if they'd been broken and reformed over and over again. And they were arranged in perfect circles, buried at varying depths. Circles within circles, as if someone were trying to create some kind of barrier. I reported the findings to my superiors. I expected them to halt the project, call in archaeologists, and follow normal protocols for historical discoveries. But instead, we were ordered to speed up the excavation. Ignore the anomalies, they said. Keep digging. I should have stopped right then and there. I should have given up on the project and gone home. But I was a military engineer. I followed orders. It was on the 10th day of digging that we found the camera. We were at the deepest level, about 20 meters below the surface. Jimmy Torino's excavator hit what we thought was an air pocket. The equipment passed through what should have been solid ground and fell into a void. When we shined light into the hole, we saw a natural cave beneath, but it wasn't a normal formation. The walls were too smooth, too symmetrical, as if shaped by human hands, or for something that wanted to appear human. We descended with caving gear. Jimmy, I, 2 technicians, Peterson and Martinez, and the safety supervisor, a former ranger named Colonel Wright. 5 people descending to what we thought was an interesting archaeological discovery. The chamber was enormous, the size of a cathedral, with the ceiling disappearing into darkness above us. The walls were covered with more of those strange symbols, but here they were arranged in complex patterns, as if telling a story, and there were skeletons everywhere. They weren't normal human skeletons, or at least, not entirely human. Their skulls were elongated. The bones of their arms and legs were disproportionate, and they were all positioned the same way, crouched in a circle, their hands extended toward the center of the chamber. In the center was a circular depression in the stone, like a well, but filled with a dark substance we couldn't identify. It wasn't water, it wasn't oil, it was something organic, but it seemed to move on its own. Peterson, our geology expert, collected a sample of the substance. The moment the container touched the surface, the whole thing began to bubble, and we began to hear sounds, whispers, hundreds of them, echoing off the chamber walls, in languages none of us recognized, but somehow we could understand. They were telling stories. Stories of shape-shifting creatures that walked between worlds, that fed on human fear. Wright, who had served in 3 war zones and had never shown fear of anything, began to tremble. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Now." But it was too late. The substance in the well began to rise, as if alive, as if the whispers were calling it to the surface. And as it rose, the temperatures in the chamber plummeted. Our breath became visible. Ice began to form on the walls. That's when we saw the figures emerging from the shadows. It wasn't the skeletons rising. It was other things. Shadows with vaguely human shapes, but moving in a completely unnatural way, as if they were made of smoke and nightmares. One of them approached Martinez. He was frozen, staring directly at her, and when the shadow touched him, Martinez began to change. His skin grew paler, his eyes turned yellow, and when he opened his mouth to scream, sharp teeth began to grow. "Run!" Wright yelled, drawing his gun. But the bullets passed through the shadows as if they were made of air, and more figures kept emerging. Dozens of them. Hundreds. We made it to the rope we'd used to descend. Wright went first, then Peterson, then me. Jimmy was right behind. But when I turned to help him, Martinez was down there, looking up. But it wasn't Martinez anymore. It was something wearing his face, and it was smiling. "Sarah," he said in Martinez's voice, but with a completely different intonation. "You can't run from what you've awakened. You brought the tools. You broke the barriers. We sealed the site immediately. We filled the hole with concrete. We buried the entire excavation. The project was officially canceled due to unforeseen technical difficulties. Martinez was listed as missing in action, presumably killed in an excavation accident. His remains were never found. Jimmy Torino was transferred to a base in Alaska. Peterson was medically retired. Wright died 3 months later, in a car accident, alone, on a straight road, on a clear day. And I was promoted and assigned to office projects, far from any digging, far from any place where I could tell anyone what really happened. But the thing is, I don't think we completely sealed it down there, because sometimes, when I'm sleeping, I can hear Martinez calling me, saying he misses the surface world, asking if I can help him find a way back. And 3 weeks ago, I received an email from Martinez's old military address. It was empty except for an attached photo, a photo of the underground chamber. But now the shaft in the center was empty. and there were fresh footprints in the dust, footprints leading toward the exit, footprints that looked human, but with fingers that were too long. Have you ever seen a wildfire up close? Not on TV, not on the news. Really up close. It's like looking into hell on earth. The noise is deafening. The heat burns your skin from hundreds of feet away. And the smoke gets into your lungs and never quite leaves. But what I saw during the Pueblo Mesa fire in September 2022, that wasn't just fire. It was something much worse. I'd been serving in the National Guard for 8 years. Firefighting, search and rescue operations, natural disaster relief, standard guard work, good work, work that helped people. The Pueblo Mesa fire started as they always do in New Mexico. Dry weather, strong winds, and someone careless with a campfire or a cigarette butt. But this one spread faster than usual. Within 2 hours, it had consumed over 1,000 acres. Within 6 hours, over 10,000. My unit was called to evacuation operations. There was a small Navajo community in the path of the fire, about 40 families that needed to be evacuated. It was routine work we'd done many times before, but when we got there, the community was empty, not recently abandoned, empty for weeks, maybe months. Houses with open doors swaying in the wind, cars rusting in the yards, as if everyone had simply disappeared. My commander, Captain Rodriguez, not the same Rodriguez from the first story, just a coincidence of surname, decided we should use the community as a temporary base. It was in the path of the fire, but we still had a few hours before the flames arrived. Enough time to organize our operations and then retreat. There were 12 of us, 4 vehicles, communications equipment, medical supplies, firefighting tools, everything we needed for a standard operation. What we didn't have was knowledge about why that particular community was abandoned. We set up camp at the local school, a 1-story concrete building, solid enough to protect us from the smoke and flying embers. Rodriguez established shifts on watch. 2 men were awake at any given moment, watching the fires advance. I was on my first shift with a young soldier named Kevin Baker, a kid from Texas, his first fire operation, nervous but competent. The fire was about 2 kilometers away when we started hearing the screams. At first, we thought they were distant emergency sirens, or perhaps the sound of wind rushing through the burned structures. But as we listened more closely, it became clear they were human voices, people screaming for help. "Sergeant," Baker said, pointing toward the fire, "there's someone there." I grabbed my binoculars and looked. Through the smoke and flames, I could see figures moving, several of them. They seemed to be running toward the flames, not away from them. "Base, this is Santos," I said into the radio. "We have possible civilians trapped in Sector 7. We're requesting permission for a rescue operation." "Negative, Santos," came the reply. "The fire is moving very fast. The area is very dangerous." But the screams continued, and they grew louder, more desperate. Baker was restless. "Sergeant, we can't just leave them there." I agreed, but orders were orders. It was at 2 a.m. that things got really weird. I was walking around the school perimeter when I realized the screaming had stopped. Completely. Which should have been a relief, but somehow only made it more disturbing. The fire was closer now. I could see the flames licking at the treetops less than a kilometer away. The heat was intense, even with all the smoke in the air. That's when I saw the first figure walking through the fire. Not near the fire, not running from the fire, through the fire, walking calmly through 10-foot-high flames as if they were just morning mist. I blinked several times, thinking it was a hallucination caused by the smoke, but the figure kept coming closer, and as it got closer, I could see it was a person, a woman, it seemed, Native American, from what I could make out, wearing traditional clothing that should have been burning but seemed untouched by the flames. "Baker," I yelled, "come here." He ran over to where I was. "What is it, Sergeant?" "Do you see that woman?" Baker looked in the direction I was pointing. For a moment, his face was confused. Then his eyes widened. "How is she? How is she not burning?" The woman continued walking toward us, and as she got closer, I could see her face more clearly. She was beautiful, but there was something wrong with her eyes. They reflected the firelight like an animal's. When she was about 50 meters from the school, she stopped and smiled. And when she smiled, I could see she had too many teeth, rows and rows of sharp teeth. Then she opened her mouth and spoke, but her voice wasn't coming from where she was standing. It was coming from inside the school, as if she were whispering directly into our ears. "Soldiers," the voice said, "you are on sacred ground, land that has been stained with innocent blood, land that calls for vengeance." Baker was trembling beside me. "Sergeant One, what the hell is this?" I didn't know, but every instinct I had as a soldier was telling me to run. "Wake the others," I said softly. "Now." But when Baker turned to leave, we found we couldn't move. Our feet felt glued to the floor, and the voice continued speaking, now coming from several directions at once. "This land remembers. It remembers the families that lived here. It remembers the children who played where you now stand. It remembers the blood that was spilled when the men in uniform first came." More figures began to emerge from the fire, dozens of them, all walking calmly through the flames. Men, women, children, all wearing traditional Navajo clothing, all with those same reflective eyes, all grinning with many teeth. And as they approached, I could see they weren't quite human. Their limbs were too long, their necks curved at impossible angles, and they left smoldering footprints in the sand, not from the heat of the fire, but from something much colder and much older. "This community has not been abandoned," the voice continued, now coming from inside our own heads. "It has been silenced by the same men who now sleep in your school, by the same uniforms you wear." That's when it began to sink in. This wasn't a normal civilian community. It was a forced resettlement site, a place where the U.S. government had relocated Navajo families decades ago, and something terrible had happened here. The figures were surrounding the school now, and each one that looked directly at me, I could see memories. Not my memories, theirs. Memories of soldiers arriving in the night, of families being torn from their homes, of children crying, of elders being killed for resisting. And I realized they weren't just walking through fire. They were the fire. The entire fire was a manifestation of their rage, a storm of vengeance that had been decades in the making. "Baker," I managed to whisper. "Try the radio." His hand shook as he picked up the communications equipment. Static. Just static. The figures stood in a perfect circle around the school. And then, one by one, they began to sing. It was a Navajo song that I didn't understand in my mind, but that my heart knew. It was a song of mourning, a song of loss, a song of righteous anger. And as they sang, the temperatures around us began to change, not getting warmer because of the fire, getting colder, cold as the heart of winter, cold as death. That's when I heard my name being called. Miguel. It was my grandmother's voice. My grandmother who had died when I was 15. My grandmother who always told me that indigenous blood ran in our veins, even though our family had moved to the city generations ago. "Abuela," I whispered. One of the figures, an elderly woman with braided gray hair, stepped forward, and when she looked up, it was my grandmother's eyes looking back at me. But they weren't just her eyes. There was something older behind them. Something that had existed in this land long before the soldiers, long before the reservations, long before any of us. "You know who you really are, Miguel," she said in my grandmother's voice. "You know which side you should be on." And the terrible thing was, I knew. Deep in my heart, I knew she was right. I was wearing the uniform of the men who had caused this tragedy. I was serving the same government that had destroyed these families. I felt my loyalties split. A part of me wanted to tear off my uniform and join the spirits around me. I wanted to let their anger become my anger. I wanted to help them get the revenge they deserved. But another part, the part that had sworn to protect civilians, that had spent years helping people in emergencies, knew this was wrong. It didn't matter what had happened in the past. My fellow soldiers sleeping at school were innocent. They were just young people trying to do the right job. I understand your pain, I said to the figure that looked like my grandmother. I understand your anger. But these men are not to blame for the sins of the past. All the figures stopped singing at once. The silence was deafening. All soldiers are guilty, the figure replied. Everyone who wears the uniform carries the blood on their hands. Then I'm guilty too, I said. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let you kill innocent men. The figure tilted its head, studying my face. For a long moment, I thought it was going to attack me, that they would all move into the school and slaughter my unit. Instead, she smiled. Not the terrible, toothy smile the others had shown. A sad smile, but a genuinely human one. You have honor, she said. Unlike your grandmother had, like your great-grandfather had before he was forced to leave his land. The other figures began to retreat, not walking back into the fire, simply vanishing like smoke in the wind. The heat around us gradually returned. The normal sounds of the fire returned, but the figure of my grandmother remained. The fire will bypass this place, she said. Your men will be safe. But remember, Miguel, there are more like us. There are places all over this land where injustices have been committed, and the dead have long memories. Then she disappeared too. Baker and I stood there in silence for several minutes. Eventually, we were able to move again. We checked our communications equipment. Everything was working normally, as if nothing had happened. The fire actually bypassed our position. By morning, we were on a small island of green vegetation surrounded by miles of scorched earth. The fire investigator called it a meteorological miracle. A sudden shift in the wind, they said. I've never told anyone what really happened that night. Not even Baker, though I know from the looks he gives me that he remembers everything. But I began researching the history of that community, and I found records the government tried to bury. In 1952, a military operation relocated 127 Navajo families from that area to make way for atmospheric nuclear testing. The families resisted. There was violence. There were deaths. The deaths were never officially recorded. The families never received compensation. The land was simply declared uninhabitable due to radioactive contamination and closed to the public. But the contamination was a lie. The land was clean. They just wanted people to forget what had happened. I retired from the National Guard last year. I could no longer wear the uniform without thinking about that night. I could no longer participate in operations without wondering what other injustices we were unknowingly perpetuating. But what haunts me most isn't the fear I felt. It's the certainty that she was right. There are more places like that all across America. Places where blood was spilled. Places where the dead still await justice. And we, with our uniforms and our orders and our willful ignorance of history, continue to tread this sacred land as if it were our own, as if there were no consequences, as if the dead had no power. But they do, and one day, the bill will come due. You soldiers always come to me after it's too late, after you've seen, after you know that your weapons and technology can't protect you from certain things. My name is Joseph Begay. I'm what you'd call a medicine man, though that term doesn't quite capture what I do. I'm a guardian, a protector of the boundaries between worlds. And for 50 years, I've been trying to warn the U.S. government about where they shouldn't build their bases. 50 years trying to explain that there are lands that should remain untouched. 50 years of being ignored. Do you want to understand what you found out there? What you saw in the forests, the deserts, the lands you thought you could simply take and use? I'll tell you, but first you need to understand something fundamental about how my people see the world. We don't believe the spiritual and physical worlds are separate. To us, they are different aspects of the same reality. And there are places, specific places, where the boundary between these aspects is thinner. Sacred places, places of power, dangerous places. Their European ancestors had similar concepts. They spoke of cursed lands, of haunted places. But as they built their cities and machines, they forgot. They decided the world was merely matter, mere resources to be exploited. We never forget. What you call skinwalkers is just a name for something much more complex. They are beings who exist on the border between human and animal, between physical and spiritual, between living and dead. In our tradition, they are shamans who became corrupted, people who used sacred powers for evil purposes and became something else. But there are other types as well. Spirits of people who died violently and cannot find peace. Spirits of the land itself, awakened by trauma. Ancient entities that existed here long before any human arrived on the continent. They all feed on the same thing: violation, disrespect, the desecration of sacred places. And you soldiers, with your bases and your tests and your excavations, you have desecrated many sacred places. The Arizona base Captain Whitehorse described was built over an ancestral burial site. Not just any cemetery, a place where my people buried shamans who had become corrupted, shamans who had become skinwalkers. It was there that we sealed them away hundreds of years ago, using rituals that took generations to perfect. You built an electrified fence around a spiritual prison. And then you wondered why strange things started happening. The New Mexico project was even worse. Dr. Blackwood and her team didn't just find ancient tunnels. They found a ritual chamber, a place where my people conducted ceremonies to keep certain entities sealed underground. The dark substance she described, that wasn't just organic matter. It was the concentrated essence of evil spirits that had been imprisoned there for centuries. When they collected a sample, they broke the seal. They released things that should have remained buried forever. And the fire Sergeant Santos faced, that wasn't caused by human negligence or weather conditions. It was a manifestation of collective rage. The spirits of the families killed in 1952 finally gathered enough power to manifest themselves physically. The fire was his voice. The fire was his pain. The fact that they spared Santos' unit shows that there's still some humanity in them. There's still justice in their anger. But that doesn't mean they'll be so merciful next time. Do you want to know how many other places like these exist? Hundreds. Thousands. Across the Americas, there are sacred sites that have been violated, cemeteries that have been built over, battlefields that have been forgotten, places where injustices were committed and never acknowledged. And as the government continues to expand military operations into more remote regions, as climate change forces more evacuations and resettlements, you will continue to bump into them. The question isn't whether you'll encounter more of these entities. The question is, what will you do when you do? I can teach protections, rituals that keep these things at bay, ways to recognize sacred land before desecrating it, methods for sealing breaches that have been accidentally opened. But first, you must accept a fundamental truth. This land does not belong to you. It never has. You are visitors here, and there are rules that govern your visit. Rules that were established long before your ancestors arrived from across the ocean. Break these rules, and the consequences will be dire. Respect these rules, and maybe, we can find a way to coexist. But time is running out. The spirits are becoming more active. The ancient seals are weakening. And the patience of the dead has limits. There is a prophecy in my tradition. It speaks of a time when the spiritual and physical worlds will converge, when the dead will walk freely among the living, when the injustices of the past will be atoned for in blood. We call this the time of the great balance. And from the signs I'm seeing, from the number of you soldiers who are coming to me with these stories, I believe that time is near. If you've made it this far, If you've heard all these stories, then you need to understand one thing. I'm not telling you this to entertain you. I'm not trying to scare you or create urban legends. I'm trying to save lives. It's been 3 days since I recorded the introduction to this story. 3 days since I started compiling these accounts. And in those 3 days, they found my location. I can see them in the trees around my cabin. Shadows that move when they shouldn't. Eyes that glow in the darkness. And at night, I hear voices calling me. Voices of soldiers I knew. Voices of people who died. Voices that whisper my name with promises that the pain will end if I just come out and join them. But I know what happens when you join them. I've seen what's left of Private Thompson. I've heard Martinez calling from underground. I've felt the presence of the massacred families at Pueblo Mesa. You don't join them. You become them. I don't have much time. I can feel the temperature dropping. I can see my breath in the air, even though I'm inside the cabin with the heater on. They're coming, so I'll leave this final message for anyone who finds these recordings. If you're serving in the military, if you're working on military construction projects, if you're being assigned to bases in isolated areas, especially near Indian reservations, pay attention to the signs. If the local animals become unusually quiet, if your electronics start to malfunction for no reason, if you start hearing voices that shouldn't be there, leave. No matter your orders, no matter your career, no matter what your superiors say, leave. If you find bones arranged in circular patterns, if you discover tunnels or chambers that are obviously too old to be on your maps, if your excavation projects reveal indigenous symbols or artifacts, stop. Call archaeological authorities. Respect what you've found. And if you see figures walking where there shouldn't be people, if you hear dead voices, if you witness soldiers disappearing or changing, document it all. Find others who have seen the same things. Don't let them make you believe you're crazy. You're not crazy. You're just seeing the truth the government is trying to hide. There's a network of veterans who know about these things. Support groups that aren't officially listed. If you can find them, they can help. They can teach you protections. They can confirm that you haven't lost your sanity. Look for Joseph Begay in New Mexico. If he's still alive when you hear this, he might be able to help. There are other shamans too, from other tribes, who still hold the ancient knowledge. But always remember, this land has memory. The dead have power, and there are consequences for every action, even if those consequences take decades to manifest. They're coming in. I can see Thompson in the hallway, but it's not Thompson anymore. It's something wearing his face, his uniform, his voice, and behind him, more figures. Soldiers I knew, civilians I failed to protect, children who never had a chance to grow up. All of them looking at me with eyes that reflect a light that isn't here. All of them smiling with lots of teeth. If you find my body, if this recording reaches the authorities, don't believe the official report. It wasn't suicide. It wasn't an accident. It was, Marcus can no longer speak to us, but we can. We are the watchers of the shadows. We are the guardians of the borders. We are the memory of this land and the voice of the dead. And we want you to know, this is not a threat. It's a warning. There are places that should not be touched. There are lands that must remain sacred. There are injustices that must be acknowledged and redressed. Keep ignoring this. Keep building your foundations on our graves. Keep treating our land as your property. And there will be consequences. Marcus was just the first. There are hundreds like him scattered across the land. Thousands of soldiers carrying fragments of our memories. And when we're ready, when the moon is right and the land is prepared, they will join us. And then you will understand the true meaning of the word invasion. We are still here. We've always been here. And we will always be here. This recording was found in an abandoned cabin in rural Montana in March 2024. Marcus Chen's body was never located. The official investigation concluded that he suffered a psychotic break and fled into the wilderness, where he likely died of exposure. Similar reports of unexplained incidents at military bases near indigenous reservations have increased 340% in the past 5 years. The Department of Defense denies any knowledge of classified operations that may have caused these events. The dead did not comment.